In the mountains of Pennsylvania rises the Cathedral of San Miguel, built with the gold of the Villacruz family in 1687. For 300 years it has been considered an architectural jewel, but few know that beneath its main altar lie the most macabre foundations in all of America. The workers who renovated the temple in 2018 found something that made the Vatican immediately send investigators. Sealed chambers, human bones arranged in ritual patterns, and engravings in Latin that speak of blessed blood for the house of God. The Villacruz family didn't just finance this cathedral, they fed it with sacrifices for decades. Today, we will discover why this story was hidden by the church for 3 centuries. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. In the year 1685, San Miguel de los Remedios was barely a small mountain town in the state of Pennsylvania, America. The adobe houses spread like beige stains over the green slopes, and the sound of morning bells marked the rhythm of a simple and devout life. The inhabitants, mostly indigenous people converted to Christianity, and some Creole merchants, lived off agriculture and the small silver mines that dotted the region. But there was one family that stood out among all: the Villacruz. Don Hernando Villacruz, patriarch of the dynasty, had arrived from Spain 30 years earlier with barely a bag of coins and fierce ambition. Through strategic marriages, commercial partnerships, and exceptional business intuition, he had built an empire that extended from the mines of the Western Territories to the ports of New York. His wife, Doña Esperanza Villacruz, was known for her beauty and extreme piety. She spent hours kneeling in the small chapel of the town, her lips moving in constant prayers, while her fingers caressed a rosary of black pearls that she never removed. The townspeople considered her a living saint, especially after she mysteriously cured 3 sick children by simply laying her hands on them. Their children, Rodrigo and Esperanza the younger, had inherited both their father's commercial cunning and their mother's seemingly unbreakable devotion. Rodrigo, 25 years old, managed the mines with an iron fist, while Esperanza, barely 18, had already expressed her desire to take the habit and dedicate her life to God. The family lived in an imposing hacienda built on the top of a hill, from where they could observe the entire valley. Its volcanic stone walls and towers, crowned with wrought iron crosses, made it look more like a fortress than a residence. The workers whispered that at night strange lights could be seen moving in the basement windows, but no one dared to ask what activities the family carried out in the darkest hours. In 1686, Don Hernando made an announcement that surprised the entire region. He would finance the construction of a magnificent cathedral that would rival the most beautiful in New Spain. "It is my duty as a Christian," he declared during Sunday Mass, "to offer God a house worthy of his eternal glory." The project would cost a fortune, but Don Hernando seemed willing to invest every last real of his patrimony. The plans arrived from Spain, designed by the best architects of Seville. The cathedral would have 5 naves, twin towers 60 meters high, and would be decorated with the finest marble from Italy and the purest gold from the local mines. It would be a monument to faith that would endure for centuries. But what no one knew was that Don Hernando's true motivation wasn't devotion, but something much more sinister and terrifying. The morning of March 15, 1687 dawned gray and cold in San Miguel de los Remedios. A thick fog descended from the mountains, wrapping the town in a mantle that seemed to absorb all sounds. It was the day the construction of the Cathedral of San Miguel would officially begin, and the entire community had gathered on the chosen ground to witness the ceremony of laying the first stone. Don Hernando Villacruz appeared, dressed in his finest clothes, a black velvet suit embroidered with silver threads, a cape that waved dramatically with each step, and on his chest, a solid gold cross that had belonged to his grandfather. His normally severe face showed a smile that didn't reach his dark eyes. Beside him walked Doña Esperanza, covered by a lace veil that partially hid her pale features. Her lips moved in silent prayers, but there was something in her rigid posture that transmitted a strange tension. Her hands, crossed over her chest, trembled slightly, despite the heat that was beginning to dissipate the morning fog. Father Miguel Castañeda, the town's parish priest, solemnly blessed the first stone while the workers waited with their tools in hand. They were men hardened by years of work in the mines, accustomed to the hardness of rock and the darkness of underground tunnels. However, that day there was something different in the atmosphere that made them nervous. "Lord," proclaimed Father Castaneda with resonant voice, "bless this stone and let a temple worthy of your glory rise upon it. May these walls protect the faithful, and may this altar witness miracles and devotion." Don Hernando then approached the stone, and in a gesture that surprised everyone, cut his palm with a ceremonial knife he had brought hidden in his cape. Blood flowed abundantly, falling onto the limestone, which immediately absorbed the crimson liquid as if it were thirsty. "With my blood I consecrate this work," murmured Don Hernando, though his words were heard only by those closest. "May my sacrifice ensure the eternity of this sacred temple." The onlookers exchanged uneasy glances. Although it wasn't completely unusual for benefactors to show extreme devotion, there was something in Don Hernando's feverish gaze and in the almost ritual manner in which he had spilled his blood that raised their skin. But what really disturbed them was what happened next. When the workers began to excavate to place the foundations, the earth seemed to move by itself. The picks sank with unnatural ease, as if the ground were softer than it should be in that rocky area, and when they reached 2 meters deep, one of the workers screamed in terror. "Señor Villacruz!" exclaimed Pedro Morales, an experienced miner whose face had lost all color. "There's something here." Everyone approached the edge of the excavation. At the bottom of the hole, partially visible among the disturbed earth, whitish forms could be seen that appeared to be bones. But they weren't animal bones. They were clearly human remains. A skull that smiled macabrely toward the gray sky, ribs that formed perfect arches, and long bones arranged in patterns that didn't seem natural. Don Hernando descended into the hole with surprising agility for a man of his age. He knelt beside the remains and examined them with an expression that was more of satisfaction than horror. His fingers caressed the skull with a familiarity that made several spectators instinctively step back. "This is a sign," he finally declared, raising his eyes to the crowd watching from above. "God shows us that this place has already been consecrated by sacrifice. We will continue construction. These bones will remain here as part of the sacred foundation." Father Castaneda seemed uncomfortable, but didn't dare contradict the man who was financing the most ambitious work the town had ever seen. "If you believe it appropriate, Don Hernando," he murmured with uncertain voice, "although perhaps we should consult with the bishopric about—" "It won't be necessary," interrupted Don Hernando firmly. "God speaks through signs, and this sign is clear. Construction will continue as planned." That night, several workers abandoned the project. They told their families they had seen something in Don Hernando's eyes that had terrified them, something that wasn't human. And Pedro Morales, the miner who had made the discovery, disappeared that same night without leaving a trace. His wife searched for him for days but never found his body or any explanation about his fate. The only thing she found was his favorite tool, a pick with a carved wooden handle, abandoned in the place where they had found the bone. From that day, the construction of the cathedral acquired a frenetic but also sinister rhythm. The workers who remained on the project reported strange events. Tools that moved by themselves during the night, whispers that seemed to emerge from the stones, and a constant sensation of being watched by invisible eyes. During the following 18 months, construction of the Cathedral of San Miguel advanced at a pace that defied all logic. The towers rose toward the sky like accusing fingers. The naves took shape with architectural perfection that seemed divine, and the walls were covered with such detailed carvings that local artists swore the figures moved when no one was watching. But the price of this miraculous speed was paid in blood and terror. Each month, at least one worker disappeared. Always the most skilled, the most dedicated, those whose hands seemed blessed with special talent for construction. Pedro Morales had been only the first. He was followed by master mason Joaquin Herrera, stone carver Antonio Vasquez, and young apprentice Carlos Mendoza, whose only crime had been demonstrating exceptional gift for gold work. Their families searched desperately, but it was as if the earth had swallowed them. There were no bodies, no traces, no explanations, only the thick silence of the mountain and Don Hernando Villacruz's increasingly feverish gaze when he supervised the work. The surviving workers began to whisper among themselves. They spoke of strange lights seen at the Villacruz hacienda during new moon nights, of chants in Latin that floated on the wind when fog descended from the mountain, and of the way Doña Esperanza looked at them when she passed by the construction site, as if evaluating cattle for slaughter. Father Castaneda had also begun showing signs of unease. His sermons, once full of hope and celebration for the magnificent cathedral rising in his town, had become somber. He constantly spoke of the price of sin, the need for purification, and how God sometimes demanded sacrifices that mortals couldn't understand. "There are things," he murmured one night to the sacristan, "things happening in this construction that aren't natural. Don Hernando says it's divine will, but I feel something darker moving among these stones." The sacristan, an older man named Tomas who had served in the church for 30 years, nodded gravely. "The bones, Father," he whispered. "Every time they dig deeper, they find more bones, and they aren't ancient. Some still have flesh attached." Meanwhile, the Villacruz family seemed to prosper supernaturally. Their mines produced more silver than ever, their businesses expanded throughout the region, and their influence grew to the point that even colonial authorities showed them respect, bordering on fear. Rodrigo Villacruz had assumed a more prominent role in construction supervision. His presence was constant at the site, and workers noted that his gaze had become as penetrating and cold as his father's. He always carried with him a black leather notebook in which he constantly wrote but never allowed anyone to see what he recorded. Esperanza the younger had also changed. Her beauty, once radiant and angelic, had acquired a disturbing quality. Her skin was too pale, her eyes too bright, and when she smiled there was something in that smile that spoke of terrible secrets. She no longer talked about taking the habit. Instead, she spent hours in a basement room of the hacienda, from which sometimes muffled screams emerged that the servants attributed to very intense prayers. The hacienda's servants had also begun disappearing. First it was Maria, the cook who had served the family for 10 years. Then Diego, the stable boy who knew all the horses' secrets. After that, Catalina, Doña Esperanza's personal maid, who had confessed to her sister that she had seen things in the basement that weren't of this world. When the families of the disappeared came to the hacienda to ask about their loved ones, Don Hernando received them with a courteous smile and explanations that were always different but always convincing. Maria had decided to return to her hometown without notice. Diego had found work on a larger hacienda in Guadalajara. Catalina had fled with a secret lover. The explanations were plausible, but there was something in the way Don Hernando gave them, in the way his eyes never blinked while speaking, that left visitors with a feeling of deep terror. And then there was the smell, a sickly, sweet, and nauseating odor that began emanating from the cathedral under construction during the summer months of 1688. The workers noticed it first near the foundations, especially in areas where more bones had been found. It was a smell that reminded them of withered flowers mixed with something more sinister, something that made the stomach turn and filled dreams with nightmares. When some workers suggested they should investigate the source of the smell, Don Hernando was categorical. "It is the smell of sanctity," he declared. "The stones themselves are being blessed by divine presence. Only the pure of heart can perceive it as what it really is, the perfume of paradise." But at night, when the wind blew from the direction of the cathedral toward the town, mothers closed their windows and whispered prayers to protect their children from whatever was growing in the shadows of that supposedly sacred temple. The truth was that something had awakened in San Miguel de los Remedios, something that had been sleeping in the earth for centuries, waiting for the precise moment to rise. And the Villacruz family not only knew it, but had been carefully feeding it, sacrifice after sacrifice, preparing it for a purpose that still remained hidden in the shadows. On October 13, 1688, Feast of Our Lady of the Pillar, an unexpected visitor arrived in San Miguel de los Remedios, who would forever change the course of this macabre story. Brother Alessandro Benedetti, a papal investigator sent from Rome to document the miracles and prodigies reported in New Spain's churches, appeared, riding up the mountain path, like a spectral apparition in the dawn mist. Brother Benedetti was a thin, pale man of about 40 years, with gray eyes that seemed capable of seeing directly into people's souls. His reputation preceded him. He had investigated cases of demonic possession in Milan, documented miraculous apparitions in Salamanca, and had been responsible for exposing several cases of false miracles that had deceived entire communities for years. Don Hernando received the papal investigator with all the honors due his rank, but those who knew him well could notice unusual tension in his normally controlled manners. His hands trembled slightly when he offered wine to Brother Benedetti, and his smile seemed more a forced grimace than genuine hospitality. "I have come," explained Brother Benedetti during the welcome dinner, "because extraordinary reports about this cathedral you're building have reached Rome. It's said that the work progresses with miraculous speed, that the stones themselves seem to be placed by divine will, and that the place is being blessed with supernatural signs." Doña Esperanza, seated at the other end of the table, dropped her wine cup. The red liquid spread over the white tablecloth like a blood stain, and for a moment the silence in the dining room was total. "Forgive me," she murmured, but her voice sounded strangled. What kind of signs?" The papal investigator observed her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to read secrets written in forgotten tongues. "Lights that move without visible source, angelic chants heard during the night, and testimonies from workers who claim to have seen holy figures materializing to bless the work. Phenomena that, if authentic, could convert this cathedral into a pilgrimage center of worldwide importance." Rodrigo Villacruz leaned forward with what seemed genuine interest, but there was a rigidity in his posture that betrayed extreme nervousness. "And how do you verify the authenticity of such phenomena, brother?" "Meticulous observation," replied Benedetti, cutting a piece of meat with precise movements. "Exhaustive documentation, detailed interrogations of witnesses, and of course, physical examination of any material evidence that may exist." He made a significant pause. "I also have certain sensitivity to detect presences that aren't of divine origin." The rest of dinner passed in tense silence, interrupted only by the clinking of silverware against porcelain and the sound of wind moaning through the hacienda's towers. The next morning, Brother Benedetti began his investigation. He inspected every inch of the cathedral under construction, taking detailed notes in a leather notebook he carried with him. He interrogated workers, Father Castaneda, and several townspeople who claimed to have witnessed the supernatural phenomena. But it was when he reached the foundations that his investigation took a dramatic turn. "This is unusual," he murmured, kneeling beside one of the foundation stones, where dark stains that seemed to have been absorbed by the rock were still visible. He took out a small glass vial and scraped some samples of the stains. "Do you know what this substance is, Don Hernando?" "Surely mud mixed with rain from recent storms," replied Don Hernando too quickly, but his voice betrayed anxiety that hadn't been present before. Brother Benedetti didn't seem convinced. He continued his examination, and when he reached the area where the first bones had been found, his expression changed completely. He stood slowly, and when he addressed Don Hernando, there was glacial authority in his voice. "These bones," he said, pointing to the remains still visible among the foundation stones, "aren't ancient as you claimed. Some have marks suggesting violent death, and there's something else." He took out a magnifying glass from his bag and handed it to Don Hernando. "Look at the marks on this femur." Don Hernando took the magnifying glass with hands that now trembled visibly. When he focused on the bone, he paled to a cadaverous tone. Engraved on the bone's surface, barely visible but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for, were symbols that didn't belong to any known Christian tradition. "Can you explain what these engravings mean, Don Hernando?" asked Brother Benedetti with dangerously soft voice. It was then that Don Hernando made the mistake that would seal his family's fate. Instead of maintaining his facade of ignorance, his nervousness betrayed him, and he responded without thinking. They're consecration marks, to ensure the sacrificed soul remains bound to the sacred place." The silence that followed was deafening. Brother Benedetti stared fixedly at Don Hernando, and in his gray eyes was reflected a terrible and complete understanding. "Sacrificed," he repeated slowly. "You use that word in the literal sense." Don Hernando realized too late what he had revealed. His face transformed, and for the first time in years he showed his true nature, a mask of terror and guilt that made him seem more demon than man. "I didn't mean to say. It's just an expression." But Brother Benedetti had already seen enough. He had faced evil before, in many different forms, and recognized its unmistakable signs. Without saying another word, he put away his magnifying glass, closed his notebook, and headed toward the cathedral exit. "Where are you going, brother?" shouted Don Hernando behind him, and there was a note of desperate panic in his voice. The papal investigator stopped at the threshold and turned slowly. When he spoke, his voice resonated with the authority of centuries of ecclesiastical tradition and the weight of divine justice. "I'm going to write my report," he said with deadly calm. "And then I'm going to pray for the souls of all those whose bones lie beneath this cursed cathedral." That night, while Brother Benedetti wrote frantically in his room at the town inn, documenting every detail of his macabre discovery, the Villacruz gathered in the basement of their hacienda for a family conference that would determine their fate. What they didn't know was that their darkest secret was about to be exposed, and that the consequences of decades of ritual murders would finally reach them in the most terrible way they could imagine. The pre-dawn of October 14th brought with it a fog so thick it seemed solid, wrapping the Villacruz hacienda in a shroud that muffled all sounds from outside. In the mansion's basement, illuminated by black candles that gave off oily and nauseating smoke, the family had gathered around a stone table that had served purposes no Christian should know. Don Hernando paced back and forth like a caged animal, his usual composure completely destroyed. The wrinkles on his face seemed deeper under the flickering candlelight, and his eyes shone with fierce desperation that transformed his distinguished appearance into something wild and terrifying. "The investigator knows," he growled, striking the table with his fist. "I saw it in his eyes. He knows exactly what we've been doing here." Doña Esperanza remained seated with supernatural calm, her fingers caressing the black pearl rosary she never removed. But the pearls weren't what they seemed. Under the candlelight, one could see that each had tiny symbols engraved that pulsed with their own reddish light, like small beating hearts. "Then we must act before he can send his report to Rome," she murmured with honeyed voice. "Oh, more disappearance won't attract attention. Mountain paths are dangerous. Bandits abound." Rodrigo looked up from the black notebook in which he had been writing furiously. The pages were covered with symbols and diagrams that seemed to move when looked at directly, as if the ink lines were alive. "No," he said firmly, "it's too late for that. If Brother Benedetti disappears now after specifically investigating our cathedral, Rome will send a full investigation, inquisitors perhaps. We can't risk it." Esperanza the Younger, who had remained silent in a corner of the basement, slowly approached the table. Her transformation was the most dramatic of all. The angelic girl she had been had become something that radiated disturbing and unnatural beauty. Her skin had a pearlescent glow that didn't seem human, and when she smiled, one could see that her teeth had grown slightly, becoming sharper. "There's another way," she whispered, and her voice had a hypnotic quality that made everyone turn toward her. "The cathedral ritual isn't complete. We need a final sacrifice, one powerful enough to permanently seal what we've awakened. A man of God, a papal investigator. His blood would have special power." Don Hernando looked at her with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Are you suggesting that we—" "I'm suggesting we make his investigation part of our ritual," continued Esperanza with that terrible smile. "That we make his discovery the final component we need to complete our work. His death won't just be murder, it will be consecration." While the Villacruz family planned their most atrocious act, Brother Benedetti worked frantically in his room at the inn. By the light of a rapidly consuming candle, he wrote his report with desperate urgency, as if he knew time was running out. "The evidence is unequivocal," he wrote in increasingly hurried handwriting. "The bones found in the foundations show signs of violent ritual death. The marks engraved in the remains suggest occult practices dating from pre-Christian traditions. possibly of Aztec or Maya origin, combined with elements of European black magic. The Villacruz family isn't building a cathedral to honor God, but to house something much more sinister. A soft knock at the door made him stop. "Brother Benedetti," came Esperanza the younger's voice, sweet and innocent. "I'm Esperanza Villacruz. Could I speak with you for a moment? I have important information about what you're investigating." Brother Benedetti looked toward the door with distrust. His experience had taught him to mistrust offers of help that came at such convenient moments, but he also knew he needed all possible information if he wanted to expose the truth before it was too late. "One moment, miss," he responded, quickly hiding his notes in a leather bag he concealed under his mattress. He opened the door just a crack, keeping his body as a barrier between the young woman and the room's interior. Esperanza was there, wrapped in a white cloak that made her appear like an apparition in the corridor's darkness. Her face, illuminated by the candle she carried, showed an expression of anguish that seemed genuine. "Brother," she whispered, looking nervously toward the corridor's ends. "I can't speak here. My family, if they knew I was with you. Please, I need to show you something in the cathedral. Something that will prove everything you suspect." "In the cathedral? At this hour?" "It's the only time we can do it without being seen," insisted Esperanza. "What my family has been doing is worse than you imagine, much worse. But I have proof. Documents my father hides, objects that will demonstrate his crimes." Brother Benedetti hesitated. Every instinct screamed not to trust her, but the urgency in the young woman's voice seemed real. And if she really had evidence, very well, he decided finally. "But we'll go together and keep this secret until I can examine what you have to show me." 20 minutes later, two hooded figures crossed the town square toward the cathedral under construction. The fog was so dense they could barely see 2 meters ahead, and their steps echoed disturbingly in the absolute silence of the pre-dawn. When they reached the cathedral, Esperanza took out a key from her cloak. "My family has complete access to the work," she explained while opening a side door that gave access to the half-built temple's interior. The cathedral's interior was a labyrinth of scaffolding, stone blocks, and abandoned tools. The partially finished columns rose like giant skeletons in the darkness, and the echo of their steps created a macabre symphony that seemed to awaken sleeping spirits. "This way," whispered Esperanza, guiding him toward what would be the main altar. "Below the altar, there's a secret chamber. That's where my father keeps the proof of what he's been doing." But when they reached the center of the altar, Esperanza stopped abruptly. She turned toward Brother Benedetti with a smile that no longer had anything angelic about it. "Do you know something, brother?" she said with a voice that had lost all pretense of innocence. "You're right to suspect my family. But you're wrong about one very important thing." "About what?" asked Benedetti, and his hand moved instinctively toward the crucifix he wore at his neck. "In thinking I'm a victim of my family's crimes," replied Esperanza, and her eyes began to shine with light that wasn't human, "when actually I'm their architect." At that moment, torches strategically placed around the altar lit simultaneously, as if ignited by an invisible force. The light revealed something that made Brother Benedetti recoil in horror. The altar wasn't just a stone structure. It was built directly over what appeared to be a deep well, and the walls of that well were completely covered with human bones arranged in complex geometric patterns. Skulls, femurs, ribs, and other remains formed symbols that pulsed with their own reddish light, as if they were alive. And it wasn't just bones. Distributed among the remains were personal objects, tools from missing workers, jewelry from women who never returned home, and crucifixes that had been profaned in ways that would make angels weep. "Welcome to the true heart of our cathedral," said a voice behind him. Brother Benedetti turned to find Don Hernando, Doña Esperanza, and Rodrigo, who had appeared silently from the shadows. They no longer wore their masks of Christian respectability. Their faces showed cruel satisfaction that made them seem like demons disguised as humans. "For years," continued Don Hernando, slowly approaching, "we've been feeding what inhabits this place. With each sacrifice, with each soul we offer, our power grows, and our cathedral, our beautiful cathedral, is simply the vessel to house a force that will convert this region into our personal kingdom." "What? What have you awakened?" managed to articulate Benedetti, though his voice trembled with terror. Something that slept in these mountains since before the Spanish conquistadors arrived, replied Doña Esperanza, and her voice resonated with echoes that seemed to come from the earth's depths. The Aztec priests knew it, venerated it, and when the Christians came, they sealed it here, waiting for the right moment to free it. We are that moment, added Rodrigo, and the black notebook in his hands began to glow with the same reddish light emanating from the bones. Each death, each sacrifice, each drop of blood spilled in the name of this cathedral's construction has been a step toward its complete awakening. Brother Benedetti then understood the magnitude of the horror he had discovered. It wasn't simply a family of murderers disguised as devout Christians. It was something much worse. They had been deliberately feeding an ancestral entity, using cathedral construction as cover for rituals dating from lost civilizations. "And you, brother," said Esperanza the Younger with that terrible smile, "will be the final sacrifice. Your blood, the blood of a papal investigator, will complete the ritual. When dawn breaks, our creature will have fully awakened, and this cathedral will become its temple." Brother Benedetti retreated instinctively but realized he was surrounded. The Villacruz had positioned themselves strategically, blocking all possible exits from the altar. In the flickering torchlight, their faces had lost all semblance of humanity, showing bloodthirst that had been hidden under decades of pious masks. "You don't understand what you're doing," managed to say Benedetti, his training in exorcisms and demonology taking control of his initial terror. "The forces you're invoking cannot be controlled. They'll destroy everything in their path, including you." Don Hernando let out a laugh that resonated in the partially built vaults like the bark of a beast. "Control, brother? We don't seek to control our creature. We seek to serve it. In exchange, it has granted us power, wealth, and a life extending far beyond what should be humanly possible. Look at us carefully," added Doña Esperanza, approaching with steps that produced no sound on the stone. "Do you think we're the same ones who built this cathedral 40 years ago? My husband was 60 when we started. I was 40. Our children were barely adolescents." Benedetti observed more carefully and felt his blood freeze. They were right. Don Hernando appeared the same age as when cathedral construction had begun 4 decades earlier. All four maintained an unnatural youth that now, under the reddish light emanating from the bone well, revealed their true nature. "How long have you been doing this?" he whispered. "Since 1645, replied Rodrigo with sinister pride, "when my great-grandfather accidentally discovered the creature during a mining excavation. It has been fed by generations of our family, and each generation has received its reward: eternal life, unlimited power, and the satisfaction of serving something infinitely superior to the lesser gods Christians worship." Esperanza the Younger approached even closer, and Benedetti could see that her eyes had completely changed. The pupils were vertical like a reptile's, and the iris shone with golden tones that moved like molten metal. "Do you know what's most beautiful about all this, brother?" she whispered in his ear with a voice that seemed to come from hell's depths. "Your investigation, your report, your death. Everything will be catalogued by the church as a tragic accident, a devout investigator who died while documenting a miracle. Your blood will consecrate our work, and your death will legitimize it before Rome." It was then that Brother Benedetti made the decision that would change the course of this entire macabre story. Instead of continuing to retreat, he launched himself forward, directly toward the bone well. His movement was so unexpected that the Villacruz couldn't react in time. Benedetti had calculated that if he was going to die, at least he would make his death useless for their plans. But when his feet touched the well's edge, something extraordinary happened. The crucifix he wore at his neck, a relic blessed by the Pope himself and containing a fragment of the true cross, began to shine with pure white light that cut through darkness like a divine sword. The bones surrounding the well began to crack and disintegrate, and a deafening roar emerged from the earth's depths. "No!" screamed Don Hernando, and for the first time in decades there was genuine terror in his voice. "The creature is suffering!" The roar intensified and the entire cathedral structure began to tremble. The stones cracked, scaffolding collapsed, and an invisible force seemed to be tearing reality itself around the altar. But Benedetti didn't stop. He took from his tunic a vial of holy water consecrated at St. Peter's tomb itself and emptied it completely over the bones surrounding the well. The effect was immediate and devastating. An explosion of white light emerged from the well, followed by a scream of agony that wasn't human, animal, or anything belonging to this world. The bones instantly disintegrated, turning to dust that was swept away by a supernatural wind that arose from nowhere. The Villacruz began to change. The unnatural youth they had maintained for decades began to abandon them violently and visibly. Don Hernando aged 40 years in seconds, his hair turning white and his skin wrinkling like ancient parchment. Dona Esperanza shrank in on herself, her beauty transforming into the decrepitude of an old woman who had lived far beyond natural limits. Rodrigo and Esperanza the younger suffered an even more dramatic transformation. Their skin began to crack and peel, revealing something no longer human. Rodrigo roared in pain while his form contorted, and Esperanza emitted sounds reminiscent of giant serpents hissing. "Damn you!" Don Hernando shouted at Benedetti, but his voice was already that of a dying old man. "You've destroyed everything. Generations of work, decades of sacrifice." "No!" replied Benedetti with supernatural calm, while the light from his crucifix continued intensifying. "I've freed the souls of all those you murdered, and I've sent your demon back to hell where it belongs." The roar from the depths grew weaker, then transformed into a moan, and finally faded into absolute silence. The well that had been emanating that sinister reddish light was now simply an empty hole in the stone. One by one, the Villacruz family members began to collapse. Don Hernando was the first, his body crumbling as if made of ash. Doña Esperanza followed, her last words being a curse in a language that sounded older than Latin. Rodrigo and Esperanza the younger fought longer, but finally their inhuman forms also disintegrated, leaving only dust and the echo of screams that no longer resonated in this world. When dawn came to San Miguel de los Remedios, Brother Benedetti was the only survivor in the remains of what had been the Cathedral of San Miguel. The entire structure had collapsed during the night, as if the ground itself had decided to swallow it. The days following the cathedral's destruction were ones of confusion and mourning for the town of San Miguel de los Remedios. The townspeople found Brother Benedetti among the rubble at dawn, unconscious but alive, still clutching his crucifix, which had returned to its normal appearance. When he awoke 3 days later, Benedetti told a carefully edited version of events. He explained there had been an earthquake during the night, that the Villacruz family had perished in the collapse of their cathedral, and that the structure had been built on geologically unstable ground that had finally given way. His official report to Rome was even more discreet. He documented the Villacruz family's death as a tragic accident during a storm, and recommended the site be permanently abandoned and consecrated as a cemetery for the collapse victims. But in his personal notes, which would be discovered centuries later in the Vatican's secret archives, Benedetti wrote the complete truth. He documented every detail of the ritual sacrifices, of the ancestral creature that had been awakened, and how cathedral construction had been a cover to feed a demonic entity for decades. The town gradually recovered from the tragedy. The silver mines that had belonged to the Villacruz were redistributed among local families, and the wealth that had been concentrated in that family dispersed, bringing genuine prosperity to the region for the first time in decades. But some changes were more subtle and disturbing. The workers who had survived cathedral construction reported that in the weeks following the collapse they had vivid dreams with companions who had disappeared. In these dreams, the lost men appeared at peace, thanking someone invisible for having freed them from the darkness beneath the stones. The families of the missing also experienced strange phenomena. Maria the cook appeared in her sister's dreams to reveal where she had hidden her savings before dying. Diego, the stable boy, manifested to his son to teach him the location of important documents. One by one, the victims' souls found ways to communicate final messages to their loved ones before finding eternal rest. Father Castaneda, who had been struggling with guilt for not recognizing the Villacruz family's true nature, experienced a profound spiritual transformation. His sermons became more powerful, his counsel wiser, and he developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when something wasn't right in his community. It's as if, he confessed years later to a colleague, as if the souls of the innocents who died had left me part of their wisdom. I can no longer be deceived by masks of piety that hide evil hearts. As for the site where the cathedral had stood, it became a place of spiritual power in a completely different way than the Villacruz had planned. Instead of being a focus of demonic energy, it transformed into a natural sanctuary, where flowers grew with unusually vibrant colors, where birds sang melodies that calmed the soul, and where people came to find peace in moments of great anguish. Brother Benedetti remained in San Miguel de los Remedios for 6 more months, helping the community heal and ensuring no traces of the demonic influence that had infected the place remained. When he finally departed to continue his work in other regions, he left behind a community transformed by the experience of having faced absolute evil and survived. But his work wasn't finished. The notes he had taken during his investigation became a secret manual the church would use for centuries to identify and combat similar cases of demonic possession and satanic rituals. His report on the Villacruz became required reading for all papal investigators, and the methods he had used to destroy the ancestral entity were incorporated into official exorcism protocols. Decades later, when Brother Benedetti was already a respected elder in Rome, he received a letter that moved him deeply. It was from a young priest assigned to San Miguel de los Remedios, who told him the town had prospered extraordinarily since his visit, that there hadn't been a single case of violent death or mysterious disappearance in the entire region, and that the site where the cathedral had stood had become a pilgrimage place for people seeking spiritual healing. It's as if, wrote the young priest, something sacred had grown from the ashes of something profane. The locals say that sometimes on very quiet nights you can hear soft voices singing hymns of gratitude. We don't know if they're the spirits of the victims or angels celebrating their liberation, but the sound brings a peace that transcends all human understanding. The Villacruz family story became a whispered legend in ecclesiastical circles, a warning about the dangers of ambition disguised as devotion, and a reminder that true faith always finds a way to triumph over the darkest forces. And though the names of Pedro Morales, Maria the cook, Diego the stable boy, and all the other Villacruz victims were never written in official history books, their souls finally found the rest they deserved, and their involuntary sacrifice became the seed of a blessing that would protect future generations from falling victim to similar evils. In the Vatican archives, marked with seals requiring papal authorization to consult, the Villacruz family file remains as testimony that the most dangerous evil is that which disguises itself as good, but also that no darkness can resist when faced with the true light of genuine faith and heroic sacrifice. This mystery shows us that even the most sacred traditions can be corrupted by ambition and lust for power, but also that truth always finds a way to come to light. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you liked this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, activate the bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. We'll see you in the next one.